Hello, everyone. I am Charlie, seasoned fundraiser, host, and producer of Fixing the Philanthropic Flow, a series powered by IG Advisors, where we speak with fundraising and grant-making activists who inspire us. How are you?
And hi everyone, I'm Harriette, an advisor at IG Advisors and also a seasoned grant maker myself turned resource activist.
And here at IG, we work with the philanthropy, business, and not-for-profit sectors to bring about social and environmental change. And today we are going to be chatting with Anna, one of our amazing Fix the Flow fellows. Anna, could you please introduce yourself and tell us a little bit more about your journey in fundraising?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Anna, and I use the pronoun she, they. I'm a fundraiser, specifically focusing on philanthropic fundraising right now, but I used to be a trust fundraiser and work with statutory funding as well. So kind of dip my toe into a lot of different spaces. And we're currently focusing on major donor fundraising. I've been in the fundraising space for a couple of years now and been part of the Fix the Flow Fellowship with ID since whenever the first cohort was. I feel like it's been a while. I feel like it might be 2 years now at this point as well. That's me.
And Anna, I've been lucky enough to know you since that very first day where you started the fellowship, and it's been an absolute pleasure. So I'm so happy that you're here with us today. So as you know, Anna, our Fix the Flow Fellowship is a movement of what we call resource activists. So what led you to making that shift from just playing the fundraising game to actually wanting to change the game, so changing the way that the system works?
Well, I think one thing that happens really quickly when you're a fundraiser is that your whole job is dealing with inequalities, right? So a lot of the charities are meant to reduce inequalities, and a lot of the donors and people we work with are just often on the opposite end of the spectrum. And I think that's something you become very, very aware of, especially as it turns to like just pure like monetary power in our current system. And in our current system, that is super important because money makes your life a whole lot easier. Obviously, our societies are, so I'm in Germany, but I used to live in the UK, are really defined by that background. I really like fundraising, but I think it's also a great way we can address some of those issues and work with people from everywhere to improve that. But also there's a lot of things that are not ideal in fundraising. There's a lot of power dynamics that have to be accounted for. There's a lot of just old things that are sometimes left over from like Victorian England, sometimes from like some other part of history, and that's a whole different interesting bag of stuff. But yes, I think I was early on, and I had a manager who really encouraged me to ask a lot of the questions. We asked a lot of ethical questions in my first fundraising job. We still do. I think that really inspired me to look for places where those conversations are happening. And the fellowship was one of them. And that was my start to looking at it more as resource activism and just making sure. Also, we're never just like, obviously we work for one charity, right? But first of all, most people don't work for one charity their whole lives, and there's always more things we're passionate about. So I think that also helps to not see each other as competition. But I'm sure we'll get onto that later as well.
Absolutely. And yeah, it's so true. It's just when we think about fundraising, it's no longer just about raising funds or fundraising. It's really about thinking about the historical context that exists and thinking about power and thinking about all these really heavy topics. And I think that's how I also see it as being different from just fundraising to actually resource activism. And so as a resource activist, what would you say was your superpower?
Okay. Yes. There's so many different aspects we can go about this. Not to say I have a lot of superpowers, but because I think there's so many interesting things we do as fundraisers. I think what is really interesting is that we provide such an intersection between people. So I really like that I get to work with the people the charity works with, but also the people who can make some of that happen because of the way power is distributed in our system. And I think having really genuine relationships in all of that is what is so powerful about it, and what makes fundraisers as people really, really important in the ecosystem, or resource activists specifically, because I think that mindset helps with that, approach. And I think that, I think just really connecting with people in the end, like you're often in a space with people who really want to make a change and being able to make that happen or facilitate that. I think that's a superpower.
You love that. It's very relatable. And so what's your kryptonite? What's really holding you back from the change you want to create in the world?
I thought about this and I have a really boring answer, and it's forms. There's so many forms to fill out. And I think this goes for every job. There's always so many forms to fill out, and some are really good. Some are maybe less useful or inspiring. But I think this is something a lot of people can relate to. You want to make so many things happen, and you want to do inspiring things and great things with people who are inspiring and do great things. And there's always a level of bureaucracy, and there's always a level of institutionalization that we often struggle with, because often I also think our jobs don't fit neatly into that. And that can make it hard. That can make it hard if you're not the most form-loving person ever. And I think it's why it's really important to have a bunch of different people in a team. Like I usually work in teams where we're very different, and that's amazing, because there's some things other people are better at, some people, like others might have strengths at. And there's also when you're working with funders, some funders really love their forms, right? And some don't care as much. So you can really kind of play to your strengths and make up a good team with that. And I think it also is representative of what we face in the funding system just generally, is like change is hiding behind, we can't do that, we've always done it this way, or we can't do things without a grant form or something like that because we've always had a grant form. And sometimes it might be warranted to have a form. I'm not against forms of any kind always, absolutely not. I love a good like ethical due diligence form, like great. But I think there's also something to be said about like how far can we rethink and imagine things if we're bogged down by like the thing on the PDF won't move because it's just there and nobody ever fixed the bug.
Yeah. You know what? That just reminded me. So when I used to be a grant maker, one of the first campaigns, and it was actually very resource activism ethos. The first campaigns that I saw was called Fix the Form, and I've completely forgot about this until this moment. So it was very strange that I'm now in this Fix the Flow world. So it was called Fix the Form, and it was just about the application forms that grant makers and funders have, and how so often actually changing a simple thing like an application form can have such a huge impact.
Yeah. And I think that's the thing, because it sounds trivial, right? Like, oh, it's a form, like just fill it out, whatever. But the amount of time like you copy things out of a form that doesn't work into a Word doc to then copy it back into a form, like that's time is money. Like in this economy. And I think it matters, and it matters on accessibility issues. You need a certain laptop to be able to do that. You need a certain person who has enough time, and you need to finance that person, or you don't. And then like it impacts people who can even apply for this, right? Like, there's so many things that are part of this. And I think especially if you're in trust fundraising, forms are such a big part of your life, whether they're internal or external or anything like that. And that is a big part of the job. So it's one that should ideally work.
Yeah, exactly. Here.
Yeah. And for me, I feel like it can sound trivial, but for me, it's also about what kind of came to mind when you were speaking about the forms is like flexibility. I feel like as fundraisers, we're expected to be really flexible in that some funders, as you said, really find forms and these kind of, structures and process is really important. Others don't mind so much. And also the difference between the types of forms and processes you have to go through, you're required to be flexible as a fundraiser, but sometimes, and only sometimes, there is progress and also fix the form, which I didn't know about. But sometimes there's a real lack of flexibility on the other side, as you mentioned, to kind of review those things and think, okay, but just because we've done this forever doesn't mean we still have to do it that way. So I think for me, I was thinking about flexibility when you spoke about that.
I think that's such an important point that you're making, because it also forces usually grant applicants into really rigid structures, right? Like charities are really different from each other, right? Like I work for an international development organization or somewhat international development organization now. And I used to work like at a national, more local organization, like to have entirely different ways of functioning. And neither is wrong, but they're just not going to be represented in the same way on a grant sheet. And then if you work at like a super local charity, again, like if you run a youth club or something like that, it's just not going to be the same. Like how can like a big organization, like, I don't know, the Red Cross or like any of the UN ones or anything like that fill out the same grant form, the local neighborhood youth club, and that makes any sense. Like it doesn't to me, and I'm usually like, how do I fit this into that narrative? There's so many other ways we can really increase just the understanding of what the charities do, and I think that's what the funders also want, right? Like this isn't just like fundraisers are lazy and don't want to do this. Like we also want to connect with the people who make the decisions on like the honest thing of what we do and what the benefit of our work is. So you do need to have an opportunity to do that. And that's only good for the funders as well, because they don't want to make decisions based on things that tell them nothing, right?
Yeah, for sure. And I think as you kind of point to, there are funders and donors out there who want to sort of go beyond the traditional models. And I know that you have a varied experience in, as you spoke to earlier, building and maintaining relationships with different types of donors, right? And I wonder how you leverage those connections and those relationships that you build to advocate for more systemic change and resource activist approaches to funding. What can you share with other fundraisers looking to engage donors in that kind of way?
I think this is so interesting because you do always have that power dynamic, right? And I think this manifests really differently in different income streams. But what I try to remember, or what I try to do, is that usually the people, especially when it comes to stewardship, they're on the same side as me. We're not going against each other like a donor and a fundraiser. Like we're not trying to talk about the money that they don't want to give out. Like that's just not happening. We want to work with them, and I think that usually brings us really genuine connections. And I've been lucky that there's been a lot of people who put a lot of trust in the charities, and then we try to live up to that trust because that matters. Like it's a lot of money sometimes people give us to do good and to do what they think is important and what they think that their money is worth doing. And I think that actually goes across income streams. I work really closely with foundations where the people who work there, they work to give money away. They work to help charities do their thing. The same with private major donors, because they don't have the in-between, but they still give their money away for a charity to do their things. I think it's really that, because you can really go on a journey with people, and I think there's so many interesting motivations of giving, and that is also something you can tap into. Resource activism is so much, right? Like there's like tax philanthropy and advocating for change in that way, and there's like redistribution of wealth through normal fundraising, like traditional, you give to a charity, but then there's grassroots activism, there's like whole other movement forms that aren't within the kind of charitable sector as we know it, as like registered by a charity commission, or, insert your country's equivalent here. And I think that just transcends it all, to work with the people and tap into why they're doing what they're doing. So many times they have a personal connection and they want to make the most impact. They're open to engaging in conversations about that, and that's just super fun.
Yeah, I love so much of what you just said, and I think it's so helpful to just take it back to, as you said, across income streams, there's humans behind all of these different kind of donors, and as you said, thinking about different donor motivations can be really, really helpful. Super, super interesting. Thank you. And I wanted to talk a little bit about our collective design process on the Fix the Flow Fellowship, where we talk about, of course, the many ways in which the funding system isn't working, but we also work to define a collective guiding star for how we want the funding system to look like in an ideal utopian world. So I would love to hear, imagining that we're in your utopian vision, what top 3 qualities would you think of in that ideal funding system?
That's a high stakes question you're asking. Right. If we're doing real utopia, like we're going far out, like my absolute dream. Like, I mean, ideally we want to get to a world where inequality isn't as persistent that we need what we're doing right now, right? So like I work for refugee charities, and nobody should be forced to flee their homes, right? Like full stop, like that's it. And we're not living in that world right now. So it's for me a lot of what the funding system in its ideal form is to get closer to that world where, and like I'm sure there'll always be some use for charities and public advocacy because again we're not living in utopia. Like otherwise I would make a beautiful painting and that'd be it. But like there will be that role, but so many charities shouldn't exist. Nobody should have to rely on charity to feed themselves. Nobody. I mean, just telling a lot of my like general opinions, but like nobody should be forced to flee. Nobody should suffer from war or landmines. Like there's so many charities and organizations that have to deal with things left behind by events that should never have happened. And I think the funding system can reflect that because I think my top thing is we need a funding system where we also question how wealth got to the places where it does and how it got often taken from the places where it is not. So much of our funding system, of our global wealth distribution is based on colonial practices, which luckily people and funders are starting to question now and starting to work with now. There's a whole system that supports this, which is based on some people have to be rich and some people have to be poor. And I just feel like we do not need to do that anymore. And I think that's really important but that requires societal change, right? And that's not going to be in our lifetime. But I do think it's part of our role to work towards that. So yeah, I think that's my top thing. And I think a lot of funders are doing that. And I think a lot of private funders are doing that. A lot of people who inherit money are doing that. Also very different in cultural context I'm experiencing. But I think that's a really, really important conversation that we need to have. And that was my top one. My second one, I think, is in an ideal funding system, we are currently in a position where we're often pitted against each other as charities. Personally, do not see a point in that. Like, not everyone is working on the same thing, but a lot of the times people are working for the same thing, especially people going for the same grants, right? Sometimes competition in fundraising that doesn't happen on our programs. Like, why are we competing against another charity for funding when we work together to reach the same people? I think we need to change the system that makes this happen, and we need to make the pie bigger for everyone instead of just trying to take bigger slices. And again, there's a reality versus utopia problem here, but I think ideally that's where we're going. Not to have only one charity who does everything, that sounds like a terrible idea, but to just work in cohesion with each other and to try what's best for, it sounds very grand, but like to try what's best for humanity and not for an organization, because that's for me where the loyalty lies. And you know what? I guess I could say like we also need more diversity in fundraising. In general, like resource activism in spaces where we talk about money and spaces where the conversation happens. Like, this was really important to me. Also, I mean, I used to work for a youth work charity. Like young people need to be in the room. Like people of color, queer people, like everyone needs to be in the room, especially when conversations are happening about them. It's just not. There's no other option, right? Like this is what has to happen. And currently, I think research activism in its like idea is much more like accessible to that because it also doesn't just include fundraisers, but fundraising as a profession has its issues and it has no clear path. And in the charity sector at large, I read this once, like it's a high status, low income job, and it really fosters a certain type of people who already have privilege to go into it. Right, like starting in the charity sector, having to pay rent in London without any safety net? No, it's just currently in this world, or when I started in 2021, it wasn't possible. You can't stay, you can't be sure where your next rent is coming from if you get fired unless you have external safety support, and that shouldn't have happened. That shouldn't happen. It shouldn't be a privilege to work in the charity sector.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, amazing. Wow. Well, I would happily join your utopian funding system. So let's start today. We're making it happen. I am there with you. We have ethics. We have like regenerative economies in there. We have equity. I'm like, this sounds great. We have to start somewhere. Dream big. So for our listeners who aren't yet resource activists, but are thinking of becoming one or starting to channel that energy, what are kind of like practical things that they can start to do to create this fairer funding system?
I think the biggest thing I would say is find your people. None of this can be done alone. A lot of it has resistance in some places. Again, we've always done it that way. This is not how fundraising works. This is not how funding works. Like there's so many things that are being said in general. And there's so many, like when we talk about these old ideas that happen or these traditional ideas, they're still around. And I think there's always people you can talk to. There's people you can work with. And I've had the joy of finding this in London, but then again, having to search for it again in Germany as well. And that just takes such a joy because you do find your people. And it also makes it more tangible that like you're not like trying this on your own. You're not like isolated just doing this, always facing something like a red tape somewhere or a wall somewhere. And I think, yeah, that has a lot of joy and support in it. And it's also too big a task. Like nobody can do this on their own. Like nobody can even do this in a generation. Like we just gotta start. So that's my biggest thing. Like find your people, like just someone on LinkedIn. Usually people who do this are like really happy to talk about it, right? Like that's why we're here because we think it's important. And there's great places to meet. There's a lot of free events. Like I know in London there's a lot of free events on this. Some by foundations, some by other people in this sphere. There's online things. There's blogs, news, everything. Like it all helps to seek that connection and then bring it to other people and bring it to people who might not be already aligned with your views, right? Like there's so much potential in conversations and in engaging with each other and openness and honesty. And I think that's where we're going. And it's incremental and it's exhausting sometimes, but
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Find your people. I love that.
Yeah. And it can be exhausting and it can be isolating. But yeah, there's so much in what you said about finding connection and being open and sharing experiences and just kind of building knowledge, breaking down potential, previous knowledge and understanding and structures of how things work as well. And yeah, just less competition, more connection, more collaboration. So many wonderful messages in what you have shared today. And thank you so much for being with us. Thanks so much to everyone for watching. Please do stay tuned for more episodes. Please like, comment and subscribe and share with any fundraisers and grant makers in the spirit of our conversation today who might need a little bit of spark in their journey. And you can also apply to join our Fix the Flow Fellowship by clicking the link below, because together we can fix the flow of resources for good.